Now in game number 3, Magnus Carlsen is facing off against Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, one of the biggest knight or specialists in the world, and this game is absolutely incredible. Here, of course, Magnus goes for the English attack with the move 6 bishop e3. And here, instead of e6 or e5 as in the last 2 games, here Maxime plays the move knight to g4. This move is very, very critical. Black takes advantage of the fact that white has not played f3 here yet, and he immediately challenges that bishop on the e3 square. Now here, if white simply retreats the bishop to c1, black's going to go back with the knight back to the f6 square. For example, bishop c1, then knight to f6, and we have that starting position of the knight orb. And this is a well-known draw by repetition, so obviously white doesn't want that. However, he also can't allow black to simply take the bishop on the e3 square. For example, queen d2 is a big blunder. Then black takes the bishop, white takes back. And here white lost his precious dark square bishop. Black has the bishop pair, and here black is arguably even a little bit better in this position, so white does not want to allow that. So with that in mind, here in this position, the only good move for white, if you want to fight for the advantage out of the opening, is the move bishop g5. So that's what we're going to cover in this game. I'm going to show you exactly how Magnus Carlsen counters this move knight to g4 with this bishop move to the g5 square. Now, what's the idea here? Well, if black does nothing, white's going to go f3, knocking the knight back, then go queen d2 and long castles. So with that in mind, here black has to do something immediately about that bishop on g5. Now, the best move here for black is going to be h6. The idea is pushing the bishop back to h4, then you go g5, forcing it back to the g3 square, and then you go bishop g7 with some kingside development and counterplay against the bishop and against white's center. Now, very importantly, if black doesn't do that, there's not a whole lot he can do. e6 and e5 are not possible as that pawn is pinned on the e7 square to the queen. So, for example, what else could black do? Well, knight c6 is the other best move, but here it's not even that good. In this case, white, again, simply knocks that knight back to the f6 square, then takes on c6, and finally goes bishop c4, and from here, white can castle on the king side or on the queen side after moving the queen, and white's going to have a tremendous game in this position. So with that in mind, h6 from black is the only serious move on move 7 for him to try and defend. So h6 on the board for Maxime, then bishop h4, and finally g5, bishop g3, and bishop g7 from black. And again, there are some alternatives, but this is the only serious attempt for black to fight for equality. Everything else gives white a huge edge. So this is the main idea you have to watch out for from black. Now here, Magnus Carlsen continues with the strongest idea. That is simply queen d2, intending long castles next. Now, of course, queen d2 wasn't the only idea. h3 is also possible here. From there, the knight jumps to the e5 square. And after that, white is going to have a whole bunch of different ideas he could try. Knight to f5, h4, f3, queen d2, and so on. But again, queen d2, by far the best move in this position. It's also Magnus Carlsen approved, so that is the one we're going to focus on in this game. Now here, black, he has a big decision to make. What the heck are you supposed to do about your development? And how do you put pressure on white's center? Well, it's important to note here, if black simply castles, that is a big, big mistake. White's going to continue with the move h4, and this pawn on the g5 square is just a massive hook for white, and black's king side is going to be blown open. So overall, short castles is kind of suicide for black here. With that in mind, the best move for black is the move knight to c6, and the idea behind this is very obvious. Black is putting pressure on that knight on the d4 square, and here castles from white is not possible trying to defend the knight, because then black simply takes the knight on d4 with the knight or the bishop, and here obviously the queen cannot take back on d4, as then the bishop takes the queen. So knight to c6, a very good move, forcing white's hand. He's going to have to either take on c6 or retreat the knight somewhere, as there's really no other good way to defend the knight here. Now, the first question you have to ask is, taking on c6 a good idea in this position? Well, the answer is not really. If white takes on c6, black takes back. And then if white castles, black's simply going to go queen to a5, followed by rook to b8, and then black is going to have a huge amount of pressure on this b file, and with the queen on the a file. Overall, this is really not a good position for white. I mean, also this bishop on the g7 square slicing down the board. Bishop takes c3 is going to be a threat at some point. So all that being said, knight takes c6, not a very good idea for white here. Instead, the best way to deal with the threat of simply knight takes d4 is going to be knight to b3, retreating the knight and maintaining the tension in the position. Now here, what is black supposed to do? Well, he has a few different ideas. One is simply retreating this knight on g4 back to the e5 square. It is quite vulnerable on g4, and at any moment, white could play f3 or h3, try to counterplay against the knight, so that's not a bad idea. However, it doesn't really put a whole lot of pressure on white's position. Instead, here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave goes b5, expanding on the queen side, and overall, quite a good move. Here, black is technically threatening b4, at which point this knight on the c3 would have to move, maybe to d5, but then the pawn on the b2 square would be hanging to the bishop on the g7 square. So b5 does come with the threat of b4 here, winning a pawn. Now, what is Magnus Carlsen going to do about it? Well, long castles is an option. From there, the king does defend that b2 square. Perfectly viable idea. However, in the game, Magnus goes for an even stronger move, and that is the idea of h4 attacking black's kingside. Now, this idea of h2 to h4 is really white's big idea in this knight to g4 line from black in the Najdorfs. Of course, if white can open up the kingside, that is going to be massive. He's going to have tons of attacking chances, and black's king is never going to be safe in the center or on the kingside. So that being said, what is black supposed to do here? Well, first of all, letting white take on g5 is not a good option at all. So with that in mind, black here is going to take on h4, or he's going to play that idea of b4, trying to win the pawn on the b2 square. Let's go through that second option first. Here, b4 is a very good move. White has to jump to d5 with the knight. This is by far the best square for the knight. And then black takes the pawn on the b2 square with the bishop. This forces out rook to b1 from white. Then black can go g takes, bishop takes, then retreat the bishop. And here it looks like black is simply up an entire pawn. However, white has some dangerous compensation in the spirit of the poison pawn variation of the Najdorf. And yes, he can simply go bishop e2 and then short castles, and believe it or not, white here is an excellent game thanks to his very well-placed pieces and lead in development. Now, b4, a very good move from black in this position, try to win that pawn. However, in the game, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave goes for the other idea. That is g takes h4, trying to win that pawn on the h4 square. Now, from here, white can either recapture with the bishop or with the rook. Both moves are perfectly playable in the game. Magnus takes with the bishop. However, rook takes h4 is also perfectly fine in this position. Now, instead, bishop takes h4 on the board. And here, black is a very critical decision. What the heck do you do about your pieces and the king stuck in the middle of the board? Well, it turns out here, the critical idea for black is going to be getting that knight back to the e5 square and then threatening knight to c4, trying to put pressure on the queen and that pawn on b2. And from there, if white takes the knight on the c4 square, black takes back with the b pawn, which does open up the b file for black's rook. So, for example, here, knight g to e5, the best move. White's best move is knight d5. Then black can jump into the c4 square, basically forcing white to knock off that knight on the c4 square. But then black, once again, gets the open b file for the rook, and here we have a very tense middle game position with chances for both sides. Now, instead of this, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, in the game, he brings his bishop to the e6 square. Now, this is a very logical idea. We see it a lot in the Sicilian Dragon when the bishop is on g7. The bishop is pretty active on the e6 square, and we can see these bishops slicing down the board into white's queen side. That looks very attractive. However, it's a little bit slow. Here, white simply castles, and again, it's not really clear what black is going to do about his king position in this game. Now, from here, once again, the best move for black is knight g to e5, trying to centralize the knight. However, instead, here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave jumps in with the other knight to the e5 square, knight c to e5. And this turns out to be quite a bit weaker. Here, white plays f3, driving the knight back to the f6 square, f6 being really the only viable retreat square in this position. And here, white has at least two very good ideas that make use of the vulnerable position of the bishop on the e6 square. So in the game, Magnus Carlsen simply goes knight to d4, pressuring e6. However, another very good idea was the idea of f4, intending f5 on the next move, forcing the bishop back. So again, this move bishop to e6 from black looking very premature here. Now in the game, knight d4 from Magnus, and black goes rook to c8. Of course, that was one of the ideas of bishop to e6 that frees up the c8 square for black's rook. However, Magnus doesn't really mind. Here he has two good options. One is knight takes e6, simply winning the bishop pair and damaging black's pawn structure, and the other is the one he did in the game, king to b1, getting the king off the open c-file here. Now in this position, the Najdorf expert Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, he plays yet another big mistake. He moves the bishop to the c4 square, and his idea is to try to get white to go bishop takes c4, at which point he can recapture with the knight, the b-pawn, or the rook on c4. Now that would be good for black if Magnus Carlsen went for it. However, instead, in the game, Magnus jumps to the vulnerable f5 square with the knight. This is the key idea. As soon as that bishop leaves this diagonal from the e6 square, then the knight simply jumps in and pressures the bishop on g7. Now black is in a world of trouble. Obviously, castling on the king side is not a viable option. Then that pawn on the h6 square hangs, and white is nearly winning here with the open h-file. So with that in mind, instead of short castles, here black is forced to go king to f8, defending the bishop. But this is an ugly move to make. Now here Magnus, he finds a very simple tactic to win a pawn. First, he takes the knight on the f6 square, and now no matter what black does to recapture, he's in trouble. If black takes on f6 with the bishop, then the pawn on h6 falls and Magnus picks it up with the rook. For example, bishop takes, then rook takes. However, if black takes on f6 with the e-pawn, then once again, white can win the h6 pawn all the same, and this permanently damages black's pawn structure on the king side. And effectively, this is a strategically lost position for black, so obviously no matter what black does, he's in trouble. Now in the game, he takes back with the bishop, trying to preserve his pawn structure a little bit, and Magnus simply takes on h6 with the rook, as we talked about. Now from here, the obvious threat from white is going to be rook takes h8, followed by queen to h6. If black does nothing, that is going to be a serious threat from white, so obviously black cannot allow this in the game. So with that being said, what the heck is he supposed to do? Well, in the game, black retreats the knight to the g6 square, trying to defend h8. However, this is a big mistake. Instead, maybe Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave should have thought about rook takes h6, and then after the queen takes back, moving the king back to the e8 square. Perhaps that would have been a better idea. But instead, knight g6 on the board. And here Magnus just goes in full beast mode. He takes the rook on h8, the bishop takes back, then he swings in the queen to the h6 square. Obviously, bishop g7 is not possible. The bishop would hang, so black has to move the king here. So king e8 on the board. Then Magnus takes on the c4 square with the bishop, and now no matter what black does to recapture, rook takes c4 or b takes c4, white is going to jump in with the other knight to the d5 square, and from there he's going to have overwhelming pressure with the knights pressuring the e7 pawn. So in the game, Maxime takes with the b-pawn, not a bad idea, trying to open up the b-file for the rook, and maybe black can get some pressure between the rook and the bishop on the h8 square. However, here Magnus, he just jumps in with the knight to d5, and now there's a tremendous amount of pressure on that pawn on e7. Now, of course, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave is a very scrappy defender. He loves to counterattack, and here he finds the move rook to b8, putting pressure on this pawn on the b2 square. And if white is not careful, rook takes b2 or bishop takes b2 is coming next. Now here, Magnus, what the heck should he do in this position? Well, it turns out here the best move is simply c3, stopping the attack from the bishop, and this knight on the d5 square does cover the c3 square. That way, if black plays bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, covers it, and the rook's pin on the pawn on b2 isn't relevant yet. So that was the best idea, but why am I saying this? Well, in the game, Magnus goes off the deep end, and he simply takes the pawn on the e7 square. Now, this move is insane. First of all, knight takes e7, taking the knight is not the move for black. Obviously, that will hang the bishop on the h8 square. So with that in mind, the knight on e7 is definitely not hanging. However, it simply leaves the pawn on b2 to be free to be taken. And here, Maxime punishes white for this mistake. He plays the move bishop takes b2. This is much stronger than rook takes b2, because here after bishop takes b2, black has this discovered attack on the king as soon as the bishop moves. For example, black here is actually threatening bishop to g7 with the check by the rook, and if white is not careful, he's going to lose his queen on the very next move. So with that in mind, here Magnus Carlsen plays the move c3, trying to defend. So of course now if black takes the pawn on the c3 square, he does have a check on the king from the rook. However, Magnus can simply go king to c2, and white's king is going to be relatively okay there. Now, the best move for black in this position, of course, is going to be queen to a5. You now have the queen activating, targeting the c3 pawn, plus putting pressure on the pawn on a2, and you still have that rook targeting the king with the x-ray attack. However, unfortunately for Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, he did not see this. Instead, bishop takes c3 was the move, And again, the bishop's not hanging yet. The knight cannot take because the rook is putting pressure on the king right now. However, Magnus has that move, king to c2. And now Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave plays the move queen to a5, supporting the bishop and pressuring that pawn on a2. Here, Magnus just takes the bishop on c3. And now, how is Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave going to continue this attack? Now here, black simply takes the knight on the e7 square with the king, and white drops the queen all the way back to the d2 square, trying to defend the queen side here. Now, in this position, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave actually has a way to force the queens off the board and try to get equality. The best way to do that is queen to a3, threatening queen b2 check. That would be deadly. And for that reason, white has to retreat the queen back to the c1 square guarding, but then black can take the queen. Queen takes c1, king takes c1. And finally, we have an equal-ish endgame where both sides have 4 pawns, the knights and the rooks. Now, instead of this, in this position here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave brings the queen over to the c5 square, again trying to put continued pressure on white's king. However, this does not cut it. Here, white, knight d5, hitting the king with the knight, and black's king actually goes back to the e8 square. This turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. The king may have been better placed on d7, where it's a little bit closer to the queen side and away from danger. Now, king e8 on the board from black, and here Magnus goes queen to c3, threatening all sorts of ideas with the queen. Queen to h8, queen to f6, and g7 in some lines are possible. Now here black jumps in with the knight to the e5 square, cutting off the queen's access to the king's side, and now Magnus increases the pressure with f4, a very committal move. Of course, does weaken the pawn on the e4 square, but on the other side, it does pressure that knight on e5. Now here Maxime jumps in with the queen to the new vulnerable f2 square, queen to f2, both attacking f4 and the king on c2. Now queen d2 from Magnus, and Maxime jumps in with the knight to the d3 square, getting it off e5 where it was being attacked by the pawn. Now finally, the queens do come off the board here. Queen takes f2, and it turns out black actually has the intermediate move, rook to b2 check, instead of immediately capturing the queen on f2. However, knight takes f2 played in the game, and now rook d4 from Magnus, targeting the pawn on c4. And at this point, we're no longer really in the territory of the English attack. However, I do want to show you the endgame really fast. It is a pretty cool endgame from Magnus. Here, Magnus simply picks up that pawn on the c4 square and then starts to centralize his pieces, increasing the pressure. Here, Magnus targeting the pawn on the a6 square. Black gives the check. King to c3 from Magnus. Then f5, defending the pawn on f4 that was being attacked. And then finally, eventually picking up that pawn on the a6 square after further exchanges. And now from here is a classic example of Magnus converting his extra pawn in the endgame, 3 pawns versus black's 2. His idea is to simply activate his king and his rook as much as possible, and then target black's weak pawns while pushing this pawn down the board on the queen side. As we can see, Magnus Carlsen just showing his famous endgame technique. He's perhaps one of the best endgame players in the history of chess, and in this position, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave resigned as that pawn on a7 is defended, and there's no way to block the idea of rook to b7 followed by rook b8, basically forcing through the promotion of that pawn on the a8 square.